4,000 years before the first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania, people in ancient Mesopotamia were already pulling a thick, black substance out of the ground, refining it, and using it to build structures that have outlasted nearly every civilization since. They called it bitumen. They used it to waterproof boats, seal city walls, bind bricks together, and according to ancient records, maintain the foundations of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Modern chemistry has analysed what they produced. The results are difficult to explain. The processing techniques required to achieve that level of material quality should not have existed in 2000 BC. Based on archaeological evidence and cuneiform records, the question is no longer whether the Babylonians understood petroleum chemistry. The question is, how far did that understanding actually go? Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the flat alluvial plain that is now modern Iraq, the oldest cities on Earth were built without stone. There was no granite here, no limestone cliffs to quarry. What the land did offer, in extraordinary abundance, was mud and something else. Seeping up through the soil at dozens of natural outcrops across the region was a dense, black, tar-like material that the Sumerians and later the Babylonians called ezeru. In modern terminology, it is bitumen, a naturally occurring form of petroleum that has been partially oxidized over geological time into a semi-solid state. The first written records mentioning this substance date to approximately 3000 BC, found in cuneiform tablets excavated from sites across ancient Mesopotamia. These are not vague references. They are detailed administrative records, inventories, trade documents, and construction specifications that describe quantities of bitumen, its sourcing locations, its price in units of silver, and its intended uses in specific building projects. The Babylonians were not stumbling across a curiosity. They were managing a resource. Archaeological analysis of ancient brick structures from the city of Babylon and earlier Sumerian cities like Ur has confirmed what those clay tablets describe. The mortar binding the bricks in many of these structures is not clay. It is processed bitumen, and in several cases, the analysis shows that the material had been deliberately heated and mixed with organic additives to alter its viscosity and adhesive strength. Someone understood what temperature did to this substance. Someone had figured out, through observation and experiment, how to make it behave the way they needed it to behave. The question that took archaeologists decades to fully appreciate is a simple one. That level of material knowledge does not emerge overnight. It requires generations of observation, documentation, and deliberate refinement. And all of it was happening 4,000 years before the modern petroleum industry existed. The word refining tends to conjure images of industrial towers and catalytic cracking units. But the fundamental chemistry behind petroleum processing is not a modern invention. It is a modern optimization of principles that are considerably older. Heat a petroleum-based substance and its lighter volatile fractions evaporate. What remains becomes denser, more adhesive, and more resistant to water. This is thermal distillation in its simplest form, and the Babylonians were doing it. Cuneiform tablets from the city of Nippur, dated to approximately 2000 BC, contain what appear to be production records for different grades of processed bitumen. The distinctions made in these records between material suitable for waterproofing, material used in construction mortar, and material used for lamp fuel imply that the producers understood they were working with the same base substance at different stages of processing. You do not create quality-graded products by accident. You create them through a controlled process that someone has deliberately designed and documented. Physical evidence from excavation sites supports this interpretation. Archaeologists have recovered ceramic vessels at several Mesopotamian sites that show internal residues consistent with the controlled heating of bitumen. The vessels have shapes that suggest deliberate design for this purpose. Wide bases for stable heat distribution, narrow openings that would concentrate vapours. These are not cooking pots repurposed for an experiment. They appear to be purpose-built processing equipment. The transition from raw seep bitumen to the refined material found in Babylonian construction represents a meaningful technological achievement. Raw bitumen from natural seeps varies enormously in quality and consistency depending on its geological source. The processed material found in major construction sites shows a consistency that raw seep material does not have. Someone was standardizing the output, and standardization requires process control, which requires understanding what variables matter and why. At the height of its power under King Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BC, Babylon was the largest city on Earth. Its population has been estimated at between 200,000 and 300,000 people. A scale that required an infrastructure that the ancient world had never previously attempted. The walls of Babylon, described by the Greek historian Herodotus as wide enough for a 4-horse chariot to turn around on top, were not built from cut stone. They were built from fired brick, bound with bitumen mortar, sealed against water infiltration with bitumen plaster, and in the most critical structural sections, reinforced with a bitumen and reed composite that modern engineers would recognize as an early form of reinforced construction. The Ishtar Gate, one of the most celebrated surviving structures from the ancient world, used glazed bricks set in bitumen mortar. The lapis lazuli blue that makes the gate visually extraordinary after more than 2,500 years is preserved in part because the bitumen binding created a seal that protected the glaze from moisture and the kind of salt crystallization that destroys most ancient masonry. Ancient texts also link bitumen to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, traditionally listed among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The engineering problem posed by a terraced garden in a desert city is fundamentally a waterproofing problem. How do you move water upward through a layered structure without the lower layers being destroyed by moisture over time? The solution described in ancient sources involves a bitumen and lead composite used as a moisture barrier between the garden's structural layers. Whether or not the Hanging Gardens existed in the form later writers described, the technical solution proposed in ancient accounts is chemically sound. It would work, and it required a precise understanding of bitumen's waterproofing properties at a level that goes beyond trial and error. Construction mortar and waterproofing were not the only applications the Babylonians found for their black resource. Lighter fractions of processed bitumen, what would now be classified as crude petroleum distillates, were collected and used as lamp fuel across Mesopotamia for thousands of years. Archaeological sites have produced oil lamps with residues that chemical analysis has identified as petroleum-based rather than vegetable oil-based, predating what most general histories would suggest was possible. The use of petroleum as a light source has a particular significance beyond simple practicality. Fire derived from petroleum burns differently from fire derived from wood or vegetable fat. It burns hotter, longer, and with a characteristically dark smoke that ancient observers found notable. In religious contexts, this difference mattered. Cuneiform temple records from Babylon and from earlier Sumerian cities describe the use of a specific type of flame in certain ritual contexts. A. Flame described in ways consistent with petroleum combustion rather than conventional lamp oil. Whether this distinction was understood in chemical terms or simply in observational ones, the priests and administrators recording it clearly knew the difference. The military implications of flammable petroleum were also not lost on ancient Mesopotamian commanders. Records from the Neo-Babylonian period describe the use of fire-based weapons in siege contexts that bear a notable resemblance to the later Greek concept of incendiary warfare. The specific material described in these accounts, a thick, sticky, highly flammable substance that adhered to surfaces and was difficult to extinguish with water, fits the properties of processed bitumen distillate with considerable precision. The Babylonians were not using petroleum for energy in the modern sense of powering machines. but they understood its combustion properties well enough to apply them deliberately across a surprisingly wide range of contexts. Getting bitumen from a natural seep in the Iraqi desert to a construction site in the city of Babylon was not a simple logistical operation. Natural bitumen seeps in ancient Mesopotamia were concentrated in specific locations. The area around Hit on the Euphrates River was the most significant, documented in texts going back to at least 2400 BC as the primary source for high-quality bitumen used in major construction projects. The distance from Hit to Babylon is roughly 150 kilometers, moving large quantities of a dense, semi-solid, temperature-sensitive material across that distance using animal transport and river barges required planning, infrastructure, and a skilled labor force. Cuneiform administrative records from the 3rd dynasty of Ur, dating to approximately 2100 BC, include what appear to be detailed logs of bitumen extraction operations, recording the number of workers deployed to specific seep locations, the quantities extracted per day, the grades of material collected, and the destinations to which different grades were sent. These are not the records of an improvised operation. They are the records of an organized industry with management structures, production targets, and quality control. The workers who extracted bitumen from natural seeps faced genuine physical hazards. Raw bitumen at ambient temperature is thick enough to trap animals and, in certain conditions, people. The same property that preserved the Ice Age fossils found in the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles. Ancient texts from Mesopotamia contain references to the dangers of extraction work, and burial records from sites near major seep locations show a demographic pattern consistent with a workforce engaged in hazardous manual labor. The people doing this work understood the material's dangers as well as its value, managing both required knowledge that was not written in the texts meant for administrators. It was transmitted person to person, generation to generation, in the way that practical industrial knowledge always has been. Babylon fell to the Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great in 539 BC, and the knowledge systems that had sustained its civilization did not transfer cleanly to the new order. This is not unusual in the history of technological knowledge. Practical expertise embedded in specific communities and transmitted through apprenticeship and institutional continuity tends to fragment when those institutions collapse. What is notable in the case of Babylonian petroleum technology is the degree to which the knowledge appears to have regressed rather than simply relocated. Persian and later Greek construction in the region used bitumen in ways that suggest familiarity with its basic properties, but not with the more sophisticated processing techniques the Babylonians had developed. The quality of bitumen mortar in Persian-era construction in Mesopotamia, analysed chemically and compared to Babylonian-era material, shows a measurable decline in consistency and processing sophistication. The lighter distillate fractions that Babylonian records describe collecting for fuel and other specialised uses do not appear in Persian-era records with the same specificity. The question historians have debated is whether this represents destroyed knowledge or simply changed priorities. The Persians had access to different building materials, different trade networks, and different engineering traditions. They may not have needed what the Babylonians knew in the same way. But the cuneiform records that encoded Babylonian technical knowledge were largely unreadable to Persian administrators. And Aramaic, the language of the new administration, did not inherit the Babylonian tradition of detailed technical documentation. What was lost was not just a technique. What was lost was a documented system, the written record of generations of practical experimentation that had taken Babylonian craftsmen from natural seep material to standardized processed product. The substance was still in the ground. The knowledge of what to do with it had to be rediscovered from scratch, nearly 2,000 years later, by a completely different civilization on the other side of the world. Modern analytical chemistry has been applied to ancient bitumen samples from Mesopotamian archaeological sites since the 1970s, and the results have consistently surprised researchers. Gas chromatography and mass spectrometry analysis of bitumen recovered from construction sites, storage vessels, and artifact coatings across ancient Mesopotamia has revealed a degree of processing sophistication that purely observational archaeology had not fully anticipated. A study published in the journal Archaeometry analysed bitumen samples from multiple Mesopotamian sites spanning from approximately 3500 BC to 500 BC. The analysis found that samples from major construction projects showed evidence of deliberate blending, combining bitumen from different geological sources or mixing processed bitumen with organic additives including plant resins and animal fats to achieve specific material properties. The blending ratios found in these ancient samples are not random. They cluster around compositions that optimize specific performance characteristics: adhesion, water resistance, or thermal stability depending on the application. Achieving those compositions by accident is essentially impossible. Achieving them through purely trial and error empiricism over multiple generations is theoretically possible, but requires a level of systematic observation and record keeping that constitutes, by any reasonable definition, applied chemistry. The Babylonians did not have the conceptual framework of modern molecular science, but they had something functionally equivalent: a practical understanding of how different processing conditions and material combinations affected the end product, refined over centuries and recorded in administrative documents precise enough that modern analysts can identify the specific geological sources of bitumen used in specific buildings. That last point is particularly significant. Sourcing analysis has allowed researchers to trace materials from specific natural seeps to specific construction sites, confirming the trade network described in cuneiform records with physical evidence. The records were accurate, the technology was real, and its sophistication has not been fully incorporated into the standard account of ancient technological capability. Control of bitumen in ancient Mesopotamia was not a private enterprise. The major seep locations, particularly the Hit deposits on the Euphrates, were managed as state resources under direct royal authority. Cuneiform records from multiple periods of Mesopotamian history show that access to high-quality bitumen was controlled, taxed, and in certain cases restricted to projects authorized by the palace or the temple administration. This is the same structural relationship between a state and a critical natural resource that characterizes oil-producing nations in the modern world, and it emerged in recognizable form more than 4,000 years ago. The economic implications of bitumen control extended beyond construction. Cities and kingdoms that lacked access to natural seeps were dependent on trade with those that did. The city of Hit, sitting atop one of the most productive bitumen sources in the ancient Near East, appears in trade records as a supplier to construction projects across a region extending hundreds of kilometers in every direction. This trade was not incidental to the Mesopotamian economy. It was a structural feature of it, shaping political relationships between cities and creating dependencies that influenced military and diplomatic decisions. King Hammurabi of Babylon, whose legal code is one of the most famous documents of the ancient world, included specific provisions governing the bitumen trade in the regulatory framework of his administration. The inclusion of a specific commodity in a legal code indicates that commodity's economic significance had reached a level requiring formal state management. Oil does not appear in Hammurabi's code because it was a curiosity. It appears because controlling it, taxing it, and regulating its trade was an important function of the Babylonian state. The parallels to the modern petroleum economy are not metaphorical, they are structural. A state controlling access to a critical energy-adjacent resource, managing its extraction as a government monopoly, taxing its trade, and building its political authority partly on the revenues that resource generates. That is not a modern invention. It is a 4,000-year-old political technology. invented in the same region of the world where it is still playing out today. Not everything the ancient Babylonians knew about bitumen has been recovered or explained. Archaeological work at sites across modern Iraq has been severely limited since the 1990s by political instability and armed conflict. Several major seep locations documented in ancient texts have not been systematically excavated. Processing sites identified through surface survey have not been fully analysed. The complete picture of Babylonian petroleum technology remains fragmentary, assembled from a combination of cuneiform records, material analysis of already excavated artifacts, and inference from what the physical evidence implies. There are specific technical questions that remain genuinely open. The processing vessels identified at several sites suggest a degree of temperature control that is difficult to achieve without dedicated equipment. But the complete equipment assemblage for ancient bitumen processing has never been found intact at any site. Ancient texts describe grades of processed material that do not correspond neatly to what would be produced by simple thermal processing of available seep bitumen, raising the question of whether additional processing steps existed that are not yet archaeologically documented. The oral tradition element complicates the picture further. Cuneiform records documented what administrators needed to know: quantities, prices, destinations, specifications. They did not document what craftsmen already knew: the practical knowledge of extraction workers, processors, and construction specialists was transmitted through apprenticeship, not through writing. When those transmission chains broke, through war, displacement, or the simple passage of time, they left no written record of what had been lost. We know the outputs of Babylonian petroleum technology from the physical artifacts it produced. We do not fully know the process that produced those outputs, because the people who knew that process did not write it down for archaeologists to find. What remains in the ground at Hit and at other ancient extraction sites may eventually provide more of those answers. The material is still there. The seeps that the Babylonians exploited are still active in some locations. The answer to what they knew and how they knew it is, in the most literal sense, still buried in the soil of Iraq, waiting for a time when the region is stable enough for systematic archaeological work to resume. The story of Babylonian bitumen technology is not primarily a story about petroleum. It is a story about the relationship between a civilization and a natural resource. How that relationship shapes political structures, drives technological development, creates economic dependencies, and ultimately determines whether a civilization's knowledge survives or disappears, when the civilization itself does not. Every pattern in that story has a modern parallel: the state control of critical natural resources, the concentration of technical knowledge in specialized communities whose expertise is vulnerable to disruption, the gap between what is documented in official records and what is actually known by the people doing the work, the way that control of an energy resource translates into political power at scales far beyond the resource itself. These are not ancient problems that modern societies have solved. They are structural features of how human civilizations organize themselves around the things they need to survive and build. The specific technical achievement of Babylonian petroleum processing deserves recognition on its own terms, independent of these broader implications. The people who developed refined bitumen technology in ancient Mesopotamia were doing applied material science without the conceptual framework of modern chemistry, without precision instrumentation, and without the accumulated published knowledge of a global scientific community. They were working from observation, experiment, and the kind of practical intelligence that gets dismissed as mere craft when it should be recognized as genuine intellectual achievement. Modern's chemistry did not discover that petroleum could be processed into useful materials with different properties at different stages of refinement. It rediscovered that fact from scratch with better tools and a different vocabulary. The Babylonians got there first. Their cities stood for centuries, partly because of what they knew about a substance that most histories of technology still describe as if it were a modern discovery. The ground beneath the Iraqi desert has preserved the physical evidence of what they built. The cuneiform tablets in museums across the world carry the administrative record of how they built it. What those two sources together tell us, if we are willing to read them carefully, is that the history of humanity's relationship with oil is considerably older and considerably more sophisticated than the standard account suggests.